Alright, it's time to talk about Avatar: The Last Airbender some more, and today we're talking about a fan favorite episode, rightfully so, The King of Omashu. We're still in Book 1, and to say that this is a landmark episode would actually be a little bit of an understatement, for a few pretty interesting reasons. It is also an episode, though, that I have a lot of mixed feelings about, which I'm going to talk about in this review, of course. And it's honestly kind of fitting that I'm talking about it this week, considering what episode of Teen Titans I just talked about this week as well. An excellent episode of that show, which I feel has some elements which bring it down for me, preventing it from really being as truly excellent as it could be. Mainly my criticism of the episode tie into some stuff that I've alluded to in previous reviews, but I'm not going to talk about that first. I'm going to talk about the episode first, give a little summation, and then I'll probably talk about what I like about this one before I talk about what I dislike, because there's a lot to like here. This is a very good episode. I'm going to criticize it. I already said that, but I want to make it clear, this is a very good episode of this show. The episode starts out with Aang still in the process of taking Katara and Sokka around to places that he'd like to visit on his way to the North Pole, showing them to the great city of Omashu, which looks like... oh, what's it called? Gondor. I got it. It's basically a big city built onto a tall mountain. So the city seems to be stacked on top of itself. It's got big walls. It's got natural defenses that keep people from getting too close unless they come in the proper way. It's very well defended, is my point. It's not the kind of city that's likely to fall to the Fire Nation anytime soon. Let's put it that way. And he has brought them here because he wants to abuse the package delivery system within the city, which uses big stone sliding carts that are moved up great slides using earthbending, then slid back down, effectively having the amount of work that it takes to utilize one of them to deliver mail throughout the massive city, using earthbending and the natural gravity of the Earth. Not only giving us an interesting look at how earthbending might be, and in fact is, used in this world, but also keeping with the Earth theme, since this city is in the Earth Kingdom, which is also interesting because the Earth Kingdom has a king over the entire thing, and yet, as the title suggests, Omashu also has a king. So is Omashu an independent city-state within the Earth Kingdom? I mean, I guess technically Kyoshi Village was kind of like an independent micronation, right? So I guess that's not unheard of. It's just a little weird now that I think about it. I might have read a thing about this once too, actually, now that I think about it. Something somebody was sharing online. That's not the point, though. It's interesting. There's great world building here. And we learn early on that Aang has been here before. He mentioned previously that he had friends all over the world, and that would include the Earth Kingdom, and one of his Earth Kingdom friends lived here, a kid about his age named Bumi. And Bumi was a genuine troublemaker. He used to use those giant stone carts as a sort of primitive, fantasy-esque roller coaster, snatching one up and hopping inside and using it to slide all the way down to the lower streets of the city. This is something that he showed Aang how to do, and now Aang wants to show Katara and Sokka as well. And they do it, and they cause a whole heck of a lot of property damage, and get themselves caught by the guards, and taken to see the titular King of Omashu. A batshit crazy old guy who seems to recognize Aang. Weird. And let's cut to the chase right here and now. It's obvious that this guy is Bumi. Like, there was never a moment once I saw this guy, especially not once he recognized Aang, back during my first viewing of the episode, that I didn't know for sure that this guy was going to turn out to be Bumi. Like, we had literally just gotten a flashback introducing us to this old friend of the show's titular main character, and yet we've never seen or heard of this guy before. So obviously there's a reason for it to be here specifically. And also he's got the same squinty eye, open eye thing going on that Bumi did. Couple that with the fact that he's old enough that he could theoretically have been alive 100 some years ago, and the fact that he clearly recognized Aang. And boom, pun intended, the guy is obviously Bumi. Like, he still pokes and prods at Aang a little bit to make sure that this is who he thinks it is, but you can tell he recognizes his old friend. It's just, it's been a while, so obviously he can't be 100% sure. And also, why would Aang still be a child 100 years later? And he seems reasonable enough, but then he gets all antagonistic, putting them in a cell, which there was some really cool world building with this cell as well. It's kind of opulent for a holding cell, so you can tell that the people of Omashu treat their prisoners well. But also the way they get in and out of the room is by earthbending a door, and then earthbending the earth back into place afterwards, which is a really cool way of securing prisoners when you have that power. But yeah, he imprisons them, and then the next day, he snatches up Sokka and Katara and he puts them in these crystal rings that are going to grow to encompass their entire bodies very, very quickly unless Aang can solve 3 trials that Bumi has lined up for him. And the trials are all interesting. They're in visually dynamic locations, and every single one of them has some element where Aang is expected to think in an unorthodox kind of way to solve the problem. The only kind of exception to that is the last one where he's just expected to have a straight fight with somebody. He's left to pick his opponent, and he picks Bumi, thinking that the decrepit-looking, hunched-over old guy will be the easiest opponent, and technically he is standing there amongst the choices. But it turns out that Bumi is actually more dangerous than he appears to be, because he might well be the second most powerful earthbender in the world. And we all know who the first is. And so not only did he catch Aang off guard with something that Aang might not have expected, which fits with the whole theme of the lessons that he's obviously trying to teach his old friend here. But in facing Bumi, such a skilled opponent, someone who Aang can't just defeat by evading them, Aang is forced for the first time in the show so far to truly face an enemy head-on with the intent of defeating them, really showing off how powerful airbending can be as a weapon. It's really spectacular. In fact, their entire fight is very spectacular. It's easily one of my favorite in the entire show. Full of stratagems and counter-stratagems, with each character countering each other's moves, almost like they're playing a game of chess. And the fight did end in a draw, with the two of them holding each other in check, essentially. And in the end, it's revealed that Sokka and Katara weren't even really in that much danger. The crystal growing over their bodies was just rock candy. They could have eaten their way out if they really needed to. And he does give Aang enough information to figure out that, yeah, this is his old friend Bumi. And they're reunited, and it's a very sweet scene, because, like, who does Aang have from his old life? Like this guy, and I guess technically the past avatars, kind of, if you think about it. But, like, really, it's just this guy. This is the one old friend he still has. The one person from the past that he lost, that he still has. And the original intention was for Bumi to end up being Aang's earthbending teacher when he got to that point in his training cycle. But they ended up going with some other character. I just alluded to her, and now I'm pretending like I don't know who she is. They decided to go with Toph instead as his earthbending teacher. And even though Toph is the best character, yes, I know I did not specify that she is the best character in this show, and that was on purpose. But there is a part of me, however small, that wishes that Bumi had been the one to train Aang, because I really want to see more of these characters interacting with each other. You have these two old friends, the older and wiser of them, that being Bumi. He is technically old and wise, still being relatively childish, but also possessing of that great wisdom, and we find out he's even wiser than we thought later on in the show. Interacting again with a friend that he had 100 years ago, who is still a rambunctious kid. It would have made for some fantastic interactions, and I'm really sorry we didn't get them. Even if I do think, technically overall, what we got was still probably better than that would have been. And it's worth pointing out, I just talked about an episode of Amphibia, also, that this episode made me think of, in which the character Ivy in that show finds out that her mom has been teaching her all of these methods of folding napkins and making tea and stuff as a way of honing her body so that she'd be ready to travel around their dangerous world at some later time with her mom. And I criticized, what's the mom's name? I knew this at some point. Doesn't matter. I criticized Ivy's mom in that episode for not just talking to her child. And it seems like Bumi's doing a similar thing here with forcing Aang to go through all of these various trials to teach him a thing that I'll talk about what specifically that is in a second, but to teach him a thing without telling him ahead of time that that's what it is. But I like it here because, first of all, this is his old friend messing with him. Bumi even comes right out and says that he was doing this in part to mess with him, and I thought that was just one of the best lines of the entire series, by far. But whereas that was a situation where a mother was preparing her child to go on a dangerous yet manageable a journey with her mother, who had already been on the journey multiple times and knew how to handle it, this is a guy teaching a kid who is woefully underprepared methods of surviving a journey that he absolutely must undertake, preferably with as small a party as possible so as not to attract attention. And on that journey, he's going to have to face situations where people are outwardly antagonistic towards him, specifically for who he is. And his best way of getting out of those situations is going to be to think outside the box, which was the lesson of the whole thing was. The implication is, anyway, that he was not only reminding Aang how to do this in a way that's also proactive, because Aang already does that in evasive kinds of ways, right? But that he was also doing this for his own peace of mind, to make sure for his own sake that his old friend was ready for this, so that he can send him off in good conscience to face all of this danger. Overall, it's a great message. It makes for a really, really fun episode with some fantastic action set pieces, situated in an episode which, in general, is really nice to look at. This is a really cool looking episode with some great world building and character interactions and dialogue and jokes. Technically, there were jokes that worked in this episode. I even mentioned a couple of them already. But that brings us around to my main criticism of this episode, and of the humor in Avatar in general. I have said before that while I do feel like there's a lot of humor in this show that lands well, there's also a lot of humor in this show that I feel like doesn't work, and some of it actually makes me kind of angry. From, like, the perspective of someone who cares about this universe and its characters. And this episode gives us a really great example of that. Like, so much so that going forward in this review series, if I want to point out where this kind of thing happens again, I'll most likely just refer back to here. Because, man, while Aang and Sokka and Katara's wild slide across the rooftops of Omashu in that mail cart has a lot of energy to it, and it's very well animated, and it's dynamic, and it has some really thrilling moments to it, I absolutely loathe it. Because, I already mentioned this, they cause so much property damage. And this is before Aang knew that he was friends with the literal king of their nation. They destroy rooftops, they slide right by crowds of people who, if they had been just a few feet off in a particular direction, they would have been hit by a speeding stone cart and killed. They crash right through people's homes, where again, if those people hadn't been sitting exactly where they were in their homes, they would have been crashed into by a giant stone cart and killed. Like, how do you get away with having your heroes do this? In a show where last week, like, not in the context of reviews, but like last week in the context of the year, or the show. You get what I mean. Last week, in The Warriors of Kyoshi, Zuko showed up and burned down a village, causing property damage and endangering people's lives. Like, aside from the fact that that was perpetuated by a villain, how is that different from what Aang and Sokka and Katara are doing here? I absolutely hate this kind of behavior whenever it pops up in the show. It just... Some of the humor in this show can be so mean-spirited. And it's fitting that in an episode with such mean-spirited humor, we are introduced to the living legend, the meme himself, the Cabbage Merchant. A man who always seems to end up where Team Avatar happens to be each week. And each time he does, he happens to have his cabbage cart and his cabbage crop destroyed. Which, it's like, technically speaking, it's a funny running gag. And the fact that it's basically a meme at this point makes it funnier, at least for somebody like me. But that's such a mean-spirited joke, too, at the same time. Like, what did this guy do to deserve having his livelihood threatened over and over again? Like, yeah, obviously he's fairly well off because he's able to recoup his losses and keep wandering around selling cabbage. It's basically all that he does in the show. But you get my point. And then later in Korra, we see that his descendant, or maybe even him, but then it was like passed down to his descendant, started Cabbage Corp, a tech company. So it's not like he's ruined by this or anything, but that's only apparent in hindsight. It's just, it's so mean. Why are they so mean to this innocuous character who did nothing to anybody? Like, I guess at the very least, I really like ranting about this kind of stuff in the show. So I do get something out of it that I enjoy, even if I don't enjoy the content in the show itself. But man, it really annoys me. But again, like with that stuff that I mentioned in that Teen Titans episode that I mentioned that dragged it down a little bit for me, the stuff that I don't like in this episode doesn't really drag it down much for me. This is still an excellent episode of this show. And I understand why it's a fan favorite for a lot of people. As per usual, though, I'd like to know, what do you guys think of The King of Omashu if you have seen it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, you might as well like the video and share it with anyone else you think might enjoy my content. Subscribe if you haven't. I'm trying to get myself out there, and I'd really appreciate it if you guys could help. You could also check out my social medias. Those will be linked in the description of this video. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.